Spoiler warning for everything in Ashita no Joe. Ashita no Joe, through the story of Joe Yabuki and his journey into the world of boxing, starting from the slums of Japan and ending in a showdown with the bantamweight world champion boxer Jose Mendoza, is a series that focuses explicitly on the details of trauma in its story. The series portrays the repetitious trauma of its boxers in explicit detail, as many of them are victims of traumatic events and recurring disorders as characterized by their pasts. Ashita no Joe deals with mastery of trauma, analyzing and critiquing the concept as not wholly true, but stating that one can never fully master trauma and that it is inevitable that one will be hurt by their actions, but that being hurt is necessary to live properly. Through the narrative of these boxers, the audience experiences the ways mastery is important, where it has shortcomings, the inevitability of trauma, and why avoiding trauma isn't always good, actually. Joe Yabuki's main plotline in Ashita no Joe deals with his passion for the sport and the grief this passion causes throughout his career. In many fights he injures his opponents, but the central occurrence of this is when he, after a long and arduous fight with his friend and rival Toru Rikishi, ends up accidentally killing him with a punch to the temple. This causes him great mental trauma and leads to him retiring from boxing for some time, before eventually deciding to come back after he is emotionally recovered. Upon coming back to the boxing world, Joe's coach notices that he refuses to punch his opponents in the head with any real force, instead opting for body blows, something Joe himself is actually oblivious to. Becoming aware of his subconscious habit, he attempts with little success to punch his opponents in the head. Whenever he does land a blow to the head properly, he vomits excessive amounts of blood, an instinctual and subconscious reaction to throwing a punch with the ability to kill someone like he did prior. After losing many fights, Joe goes on a journey to find himself, and regains his fighting ability after finding and battling a worthy rival, Carlos Rivera, without leading to any injury. Not long after, though, we find out that Carlos was actually concussed by Joe's punches, later completely losing all mental faculty after another fight. Joe is upset, but remains able to fight for the rest of his career, fighting until his death in the ring against the world champion Jose Mendoza. Mastery is a theory developed by Sigmund Freud, largely in the work Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is meant to explain repetition in trauma victims, and it is depicted in Joe in the trauma following Rikishi's death at Joe's hands. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud's key idea is that all people are seeking pleasure in their lives, but the repetition of traumatic events in trauma victims seemingly goes against this. Think PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks. To explain this, Freud says that this repetition is an attempt to master the situation, which will help the trauma victim in the long term, i.e., they don't want to repress it, and they will instead figure out what they should do in the future. Joe attempts to emotionally master the situation by resolving that he should continue boxing regardless because it is the most enjoyable thing in his life, also considering the feelings of his fallen rival. Physical mastery, however, is much more difficult for him, along with a lingering emotional trauma deep within his heart. Ashita no Joe depicts mastery of trauma as perfectionist in nature and unable to be overcome through sheer force of will. Joe tries to master his trauma and regain the ability to deal strong punches to the head by force, but his body rejects it subconsciously and makes him vomit blood. His coach even dismisses his attempt at overcoming trauma, saying, "In the end, a man can't go against his instincts. Some things are impossible to overcome." Only does he truly master his trauma by perfectly recreating the situation, fighting a worthy rival in Carlos Rivera and not injuring him, although we later do actually find out there has been some injury dealt. Every single detail needs to be lined up perfectly and cannot be overcome with sheer force of will alone, or else Joe would have overcome it prior to his fight with Carlos. Repetition is a constant factor for Joe, directly causing his traumatic symptoms of vomiting blood and being unable to throw punches at the head. Whenever Joe lands a strong head blow, we see imagery of his dead rival Rikishi. Joe has visions of throwing the killing punch, of watching Rikishi crumple to the floor lifelessly, and listening to the doctor pronounce his fight as the cause of death while staring at Rikishi's corpse. These visions are always followed by an instinctual or subconscious action in Joe's body, either stopping a punch from being completed or throwing up blood profusely. In this way, Ashita no Joe depicts trauma and symptoms as wholly physical and instinct-driven, separate from the conscious mind and unable to be disobeyed. The idea of mastery, though, is also critiqued by Ashita no Joe, depicting trauma as impossible to fully master and an inevitability of the human condition. Towards the end of the series, we learn that Carlos has been mentally incapacitated by his fight with Joe and Jose Mendoza, meaning that Joe never truly mastered the situation in a way. He was unable to prevent the trauma of injuring a friend and his rival in the fight. However, Joe does not falter in his boxing career at this point, pushing himself towards his death even. This is because Joe has realized that no matter what he does, boxing will cause irreparable harm to the boxers involved inevitably. I believe this is a fundamental truth in life, that no matter how someone lives, they will always inevitably deal with traumatic events and have to battle with them. Joe recognizes this and continues to box despite the growing concerns for his health by everyone around him, the series acknowledging that he cannot escape trauma fully. The inevitable trauma every person must face isn't depicted as inherently bad, and the series even portrays avoiding potentially traumatic scenarios and lifestyles as cowardly or unfulfilling. Many characters steer headlong into situations they know may end up as traumatic events, pushing their boundaries beyond what is reasonable. They do this for two reasons. Firstly, they understand, as mentioned before, that trauma is inevitable and inescapable. Going out of your way to avoid potentially traumatic situations is a waste of effort. We're all subject to the whims of fate either way. Secondly, living life in a way to avoid trauma is not truly living at all in the eyes of Joe and his fellow boxers. Joe speaks on this topic, saying,
矢吹君は寂しくないの？同じ年頃の若者が街に海に山に青春を謳歌しているというのに、矢吹君と来たら来る日も来る日も汗とワセリンと松ヤニの匂いが漂う薄暗いジムに閉じこもって縄跳びをしたり柔軟体操をしたりサンドバッグを叩いたり、たまに明るいところへ出るかと思えばそこは眩しいほどの照明に照らされたリングという檻の中、そこではまるで刀剣のように血だらけになって殴り合うだけの生活なのに、まだ体はどんどん大きく伸びようとしているのに、食べたいものも食べず飲みたいものも飲まず、惨めだわ、悲惨だわ、青春と呼ぶにはあまりにも暗すぎるわ。
のりちゃん、さっき俺ちょっと言葉が足りなかったのかもしれねえな。俺は負い目や義理だけでボクシングやってるわけじゃねえんだ。ボクシングってやつが好きだからやってきたんだ。のりちゃん、こいつは本当だよ。本当なんだよ。
そんなこと分かっているわ。でも
のりちゃんの言う青春を謳歌するってこととはちょいと違うかもしれねえが、俺は俺なりに今まで燃えるような充実感を何度も味わってきたよ。血だらけのリングの上でさ、ブスブスとそこらにある見てくれだけの不完全燃焼とはわけが違う。ほんの瞬間にせよ眩しいほどに真っ赤に燃え上がるんだ。そして後には真っ白な灰だけが残る。燃えかすなんか残りゃしない。真っ白な灰だけだ。力士だってあのカーロスだってきっとそうだったんだ。
The story and characters are adamantly against the sedated style of living that seeks desperately to avoid trauma-inducing lifestyles. It is unfulfilling, shallow, and a mockery of one's true wishes. This could be seen as an extension of Freud's school of thought against repression of trauma, since he states that repression of trauma is bad for the trauma victims, but taken to maybe a logical extreme here. Repetition and mastery of trauma are central concepts to the narrative of Ashita Joe, analyzing and building on these ideas. The series critiques the idea of a binary sense of mastery, stating that trauma is not simply mastered or not mastered, but that it is impossible to fully overcome in many ways. Ashita Joe also claims that trauma is inevitable, inescapable, and even something that shouldn't be avoided, portrayed through the world of professional boxing competition beautifully. Thanks for watching.